What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. As you can see, today we are off the bike again, and that's because I'm going to be changing the oil on my motorcycle today, and I figured I'd record a video and show you guys how to do it if you're interested in trying to do it yourself. As always, I'm going to do a breakdown or a prequel, if you will, to what I'm going to be doing. Just going to be going over the steps really quick, and then we're going to go ahead and actually get into it. So let's go onto the other side of the bike and I'll show you what we're going to be doing. So the majority of what we're going to be doing today is going to be on this side of the bike. We're going to start off by first removing this lower fairing. Well, we're not going to remove it, we're just going to loosen it so we can gain access to the oil filter cover. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and put this bike up on its stand, or the rear stand that we have. We're going to put the drain pan under it. We are going to loosen the drain bolt to let the oil come out. After that's done, we're going to go ahead and remove the oil filter cover and the oil filter, let that drain out. And after that, we're basically just going to reassemble everything. We're going to put the oil filter back in its cover, you know, the whole little assembly housing. We're going to put it back on. We're going to screw the drain bolt back on, fill this thing back up with oil, check the levels in the sight glass, make sure it lands between these 2 points. We're going to turn the bike on so the oil can circulate through the system, fill up the oil filter. That'll cause the oil to drop, and then we're going to refill back up to this point, and then it'll be to its proper level. And then that's pretty much it. It's a very simple process, easy to do yourself if you want to try. Again, I am not a mechanic, so if you screw it up, I will not take responsibility for it, but it's really simple to do yourself. If you don't have this specific bike, which is a Honda CBR250R, it's almost the same for any other bike. You can kind of figure it out if it's not exactly like this. Now let's get into actually changing this oil. Now you are going to need a ratchet wrench, an 8mm and 12mm socket, a short ratchet extension, a new oil filter, as well as a new oil filter gasket and crush washer, an oil drain pan, an oil funnel, at least 2 quarts of oil, and then the only specialty thing you'll need is a rear bike stand. So let's go ahead and take this off. These bolts are not on there very tight, so once you break it loose, you can pretty much do it by hand. And once you back it out, you'll see that this lower fairing becomes very loose. And as you can see right here is going to be your oil filter cover. It's going to have 4 bolts. You can get a better look at your sight glass, which is right here. And after you get this loose or taken off, however you want, we can get on to the next step, which is going to be putting this bike on its rear stand. Now putting the bike on the rear stand is pretty straightforward. All you're going to do is make sure that the pads of the stand and the swing arms are parallel. Push the bike upright until you feel it resting evenly on the stand, and then push down on the stand's handle. Now if your stand has square pads like mine, you want to make sure that the swing arm is resting flush on the pads, not on any of the corners. Alright, so now that we got the motorcycle on the center stand and it's provided a nice even surface for the oil to flow and for us to check the oil level, we can get under the bike and loosen up the drain bolt so we can start draining this oil. Quick note, I like to leave my kickstand down just in case the bike tips over for whatever reason. I can quickly lean it over to the side and it'll catch itself, versus not having the kickstand down and it falling off the rear stand for some reason and it just hitting the ground. So just a quick note. So now we're under the bike. As you can see, the oil drain bolt is going to be right here off to the left side of the motorcycle. Now we're simply just going to take our socket, put it over the bolt, and start getting it loose. But once you do get it loose, you can just loosen it by hand. Now be careful, the oil will be hot, or at least it should be. You should have warmed up the oil to operating temperature before you started the oil change. Now quick note about the oil drain bolt. It does come with this little crush washer. You want to make sure you find this before you move on. Sometimes it likes to get stuck to the oil pan, and sometimes it'll fall into the drain pan, and you just want to make sure you fish it out. You should replace this every time you change the oil, but just in case you're going to reuse it, you want to make sure you don't reinstall the drain bolt without having this washer. Keep in mind, if you have a magnetic drain bolt like I do, It is normal to see some metal flakes stuck to the magnet, but if you see any shards or sludge, I'd highly recommend taking it to a mechanic as soon as possible. Once you get the oil drain bolt removed and the oil starts to come out, you can go ahead and start working on getting this oil filter cover off. Now on mine, all of these are OEM, so you're going to be using an 8mm socket to get each one of these off. Now, like the other bolts, once you break them loose, you can just do it by hand. You do want to make sure that once you start loosening the bolts, that the oil drain pan is underneath the area of the oil filter, because oil will start to fall out. Now, once you get the cover off, you'll see that this little unit comes out, which is going to consist of the oil gasket, your oil filter, and then this little spring that sits at the bottom of the oil filter cover. Now, before you move on, you want to make sure you have all 4 of the oil filter screws and make sure none of them fell into the oil drain pan. Now, while you're waiting for the oil to drain, now's a good time to go ahead and start cleaning up all the surfaces where the oil spilled and touched, including the oil filter reservoir, the inside of this fairing, and underneath the pan where the oil drain bolt goes. It's also a good idea to start cleaning up your reusable parts, including the oil filter cover, the oil filter spring, the 4 bolts for the oil filter cover, and your oil drain bolt. Once all the oil is drained and everything is clean, it's time to basically put this all back together and you'll be good to go. Now, to start putting back the oil filter cover and oil filter, you're going to need a new oil filter, which if you're using K&N, it's going to be K&N 112, as well as a new oil filter gasket, which OEM is going to be 15412KYJ901. Now, when putting the oil filter back together, you want to make sure that, first of all, the spring is in that little reservoir that it's supposed to be in, and then the position of the oil filter. Always remember, the part with the gasket goes up against the bike. This reservoir dimpled part goes against the spring, so it's going to seat in there like that. Do keep in mind it's under spring tension, so it's going to be a little difficult to get it back seated into the reservoir, especially to get these screws in there. It's going to be a little bit of a pain, especially if you can't fully remove this bottom fairing. So once you got your oil filter and cover assembly back together, you're going to go ahead and take your gasket and put it on the oil filter cover. Now, I took the oil filter and the spring off just to better show you how this gasket goes on. There's really only one way for it to go on, and it's going to be like that. So as you can see, this cutout is going to go over this hole, and then this big cutout is going to go over these 2 holes. If you try to put it in the other way, you're going to end up covering some of these holes, and it's just not going to align right. You're going to see that it's not aligning properly. If you put it upside down, you're going to notice you have this part hanging out. So it's very difficult to put this on wrong. As long as it's seated properly like this and you can see all the holes and nothing's being covered or overhanging, you know you got it right. Now, I've always found this easiest to do by putting 2 bolts in on opposite sides to keep the gasket in place and to also help you align it to the oil filter cover. So 1 screw on, so let's go ahead and start tightening that. Now, when you're starting this, you don't want to screw in the bolts all the way. You just want to get it just beginning to grab, so that way it doesn't start moving around and it's easier to put the rest of the bolts in. Now, quick note, as with anything that's circular that has bolts, you don't want to just start screwing it in a circle because it won't seat properly. You want to do it always opposing bolts. Whichever one you start with, you do the one opposite, and then the one opposite of that, and the one opposite of that. And once you can no longer tighten any of them by hand, it's time to move on to the wrench. Now, there is a torque spec for these, which I believe is 8 foot-pound of torque, but I've also learned a lesson. If you do not have a very, very small torque wrench, where 8 is probably its outer limits, do not attempt to torque these to spec with a larger wrench. I've already snapped one of these, and I'll show you a little trick just in case you snap one. These do not necessarily need to be torqued to spec. You can do it by hand. It's really easy to tell if you need to tighten it. Once you turn the bike on, it'll start leaking. As long as you tighten it and it doesn't leak, you're good to go. Once it seats, you just want to give it one last good little little turn. So right there it's seated, and then you just want to give it just a little bit, just so it's a little tight. Like I said, you can always go back and tighten it if it leaks. It's not the end of the world. But if you snap one off, it can be, and your bike can be out of commission. Now, let's go to the other side of the bike so I can show you a little trick just in case you do break one of these bolts. So these bolts, that one right there, and this one down here, that are for the front sprocket cover, are the same size. And you do not absolutely need those bolts. You can take one of those and put it on the oil filter cover. If you don't have one of those bolts on the oil filter cover, it will leak. If you remove one of these bolts, nothing really happens because it's just a cover. Now, once you get the oil filter cover all put back together, you can go ahead and put your drain bolt back in. Now, like I said, before you start putting this back on, make sure that your crush washer is on there. This bolt also does have a torque spec, which is 18 foot-pound torque. But if you do not have a torque wrench, which I do, but I'm gonna go ahead and do this without one just to show you guys, it's the same rule of thumb. You just wanna make sure that it seats. Once it seats and it's hand tight, you just wanna give it another little tiny push just to make sure it's on there, and you'll be good to go. You don't need to over tighten it, and if it's loose, you'll know once you turn the bike on because it'll start leaking. So you got your oil filter back together and you got your oil drain bolt back on. Now it's time to fill your bike up back with oil. So you're gonna go ahead and remove this filler cap. Go ahead and put your filter in there and start filling your bike back up. Now for the next step, which is filling up the bike, you're gonna wanna pay attention to these two markings right here. This top one is the one we're aiming for, so you're gonna wanna fill up the bike until you reach that point. Now make sure you don't go too fast because this bike doesn't hold a lot of oil. It takes about 2 quarts or 1.8 to be specific, and you want to make sure you do not overfill. It's a lot easier to add oil. It's not as easy to get it out. Okay, we're at the perfect level. Now, you're not done yet. You do need to turn on the bike in order for the oil to circulate the system and to fill the oil filter. If you leave it like this, turn it on and go about your day, you're going to be running the bike low on oil until your next oil change. So at this point, once you reach that level, you're going to put your oil filter cap back on and you're going to go start up your bike. You're going to leave it running for a couple seconds, maybe about 10-20 seconds, and then you're going to add more oil accordingly. Now do keep in mind you are on the rear stand, so you do want to make sure that your bike is in neutral, because if you accidentally stall it while it's on the rear stand, it could cause it to jump and fall off of the stand. As you can tell, after starting the bike, the oil level dropped almost instantly. Now at this point, we're just gonna fill it back up to the second line and we'll be good to go. After you get the bike topped off, you're gonna wanna take it out for a quick little spin just to get everything warmed up and get the oil circulating through the system. And after you park the bike, I recommend putting down some cardboard or some towels underneath where the drain bolt is, as well as where the oil filter cover is, just to catch any oil leaks if there are any. Now, the most important part of any oil change is going to be to properly dispose of your oil. Those quart bottles that you use to fill up your bike make perfect containers for the used oil. And in most states, you can go ahead and take this used oil as well as your used oil filter and any other trash from the oil change to your local auto parts store for them to properly dispose of it. And that's going to be it for me, guys. I hope you guys liked the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope it was informative. If you like the videos that I'm putting out and you want to keep up and watch some more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you like the video, go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified when I do upload a video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.